Conservation, Parks, and the Colonial Legacies of Wood Buffalo National Park. An interview about the intergenerational harms of Canadian parks policy. I'm Sean Courage, and you're listening to episode 74 of Nature's Past, a podcast of the Network in Canadian History and Environment. In 2019, the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation commissioned research consultants from Willow Springs Strategic Solutions to collaborate on an extensive research report documenting the history of Wood Buffalo National Park and its effects on generations of Dene people in the region. Using archival and oral history research, Willow Springs published this report in the summer of 2021 and later published a series of blog posts on the subject with the Network in Canadian History and Environment. This research is part of the work of the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nations efforts to seek redress for the violence and intergenerational harms that resulted from the imposition of the park on the lands and resources of the First Nation. ACFN is in discussions with Environment and Climate Change Canada and Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs to seek a formal public apology and reparations for these harms. To learn more about the research report and the history of Wood Buffalo National Park, I spoke with Sabina Trimble from Willow Springs.
Hello, my name is Sabina Trimble. I am a PhD candidate and a researcher at a small research consultancy called Willow Springs Strategic Solutions, which operates in what is colonially known as Cochrane, Alberta. And I myself live, work, and play in what is commonly known as Calgary, but has been known for much longer as Mohkinstsis to the Niitsitapi peoples, Wichispa to the Nakota, and Gutsitsi to the Dene peoples of this territory, the original stewards of the land. Calgary is located in Treaty 7 territory. It was made home to settlers like myself through the negotiation of Treaty 7 in 1877, at which time the Indigenous leaders of this territory agreed to share their lands with the newcomers peacefully in exchange for a number of promises and protections, and most of those promises have been broken and not honored by settler governments and individuals since that time. So it's an honor and a privilege to be calling in from this place and to be working here. And the consultancy that I do research for does historical and social science research primarily, and community-based research, including the research report that we'll be discussing today.
Well, thanks for joining us, and that's exactly what we're here to talk about. The research report that you produced and the blog series that was published on the Network in Canadian History and Environment website that focuses in on some elements of the report. So maybe we can start there, and if you could provide listeners with a bit of background about this report on the history of Wood Buffalo National Park. And if you could tell us a little bit about its connection to current efforts to seek redress for local Indigenous peoples.
For sure. So the report that you're referring to, Sean, is a very recent sort of step along a multi-generational journey that's been ongoing within the community of Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation for many, many generations. This history of Wood Buffalo National Park, research into what happened to the Dene peoples as a result of its creation and expansion and management throughout the 20th century, has been ongoing within the community for many, many generations, for over 100 years, since well before its actual establishment. The oral history of the park and its relationship to ACFN and to their Dene Suthlene relatives and ancestors has been passed down, like I said, from generation to generation. And so long before I became involved, long before Willow Springs became involved, like I said, this research had already been ongoing. And over the last few decades, especially under the leadership of the late elder and former chief, Pat Marcel, Chief Marcel had pressed for many, many years that for the community's oral histories to be brought together along with federal records and other historical records and related research in order to tell this complex story about the history of Wood Buffalo National Park and its impacts, its long-term impacts on the community. Elder Pat spoke out often. I didn't know him personally. I've read what things that he's done and written, but my colleague Peter and of course members of the community would know very well that Chief Marcel spoke out often about his own family's traumatic experiences and the wider environment of treaty violations and harms that were wrought against his people, the Dene-Soothlanay, by the Parks Branch, what is now called Parks Canada, through the creation and expansion and management of Wood Buffalo National Park. So he had been doing this work for decades before I ever became involved, before Willow Springs became involved. And over the past few years, the nation has been sort of advancing that work that he started and led. And just in the last year or so, began discussions with Environment and Climate Change Canada and Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada, with the view towards obtaining a formal public acknowledgement and apology for what happened, as well as significant reparations for harms that were committed against the nation through the creation of the park and its management throughout the 20th century. So as part of this work, myself and my colleague Peter, became involved starting in 2019. We were retained by ACFN in advance of negotiations, commissioned to sort of produce this extensive research report that would do what Chief Marcel had been sort of pushing for many, many years, which is that all those stories, all those sources be drawn together to build a really strong case for the campaign. So we became involved in the summer of 2019. The work, of course, was sort of postponed quite a number of times and stopped a few times because of COVID. But over the course of the last few years, we've worked with a community-led steering committee as well as dozens of community members to write this report, which became public in summer of 2021, was shared with government officials, with the media, and with the general public. And the report really centers oral testimony shared through dozens of interviews that we had with ACFN members as well as members of neighboring Indigenous communities. And it also centers oral histories that have been recorded for decades before. And the goal really was sort of like I was saying, to sort of build this report, build this story in such a way that it would serve the goals of the negotiation team, and hopefully advance this campaign for justice, really exposing the harms and ongoing harms that were and continue to be committed by Parks Canada in Dene-Soothlanay territories through the existence of this national park. So it's been a real honor and a real privilege to be involved in this work, but I really want to emphasize it's been ongoing for a long time, much longer than I have been involved. So,
yeah, and that's a really important point that's stressed within the report itself. That this is, as much a culmination of many generations of work into the history of this park and the role that it's played in the expansion of colonial power into Indigenous territories in northern Alberta and parts of the Northwest Territories. So I wonder then if you could kind of set the stage here historically for the audience who might not be familiar with Wood Buffalo National Park. Of course, it's far from where most settlers in Canada live, but it is an enormous territory in parts of Alberta and the Northwest Territories. So maybe you can tell us a bit about the park's origins and how its creation disrupted the lives of Indigenous peoples, the Athabasca, Chippewa, First Nation, and other Indigenous communities.
Yeah, for sure. I think, in order to sort of answer that second part of your question, it's critical that we zoom out. Like you said, Wood Buffalo National Park takes up a huge expanse of territory, lands and waters within an even larger expanse of Indigenous territories in what are now known as Northern Alberta and the Northwest Territories. And so in order to really understand like the profound harmful intergenerational impacts of the creation of a park of this size, you really have to understand the territory it takes up and also, one of the things that we heard over and over again as elders shared with us their testimony about this history, is that you can't understand the history of the park, you can't understand its impacts on the community in isolation from the history of Treaty 8. So, to start with, like you said, it's huge. Wood Buffalo National Park, I think for a long time was the largest national park in the world. I think now it's the second largest in the world. It's certainly the largest in Canada. And like I said, it takes up a large expanse of territory in a region where a number of Dene, Nehia, and Métis communities have lived and moved and harvested and existed for thousands and thousands of years. The Dene Southlanais peoples, the ancestors of ACFN, been there for 10,000 years and maybe longer. Oral histories say that their ancestral claims to those territories that the park takes up are ancient. And the wider territory of the Dene Southlanais sort of historically followed, is based around the migratory routes of the caribou up there. And so you can imagine that's a really, really large area that encompasses the traditional territories of ACFN. Another important sort of, way to situate the park is within the text of Treaty, the document of Treaty 8, a number of rivers, 5 rivers specifically, are listed. Members and elders explain to us that every one of those rivers has significance within the territory of ACFN. The Athabasca River, the Peace River, the Birch River, the Slave River, and I'm missing a river, and the Gull River, all are sort of significant parts of the wider territory of ACFN. And every one of those rivers at some point is encompassed in the park. And maybe sort of to help situate people geographically, if you read the research report, you'll see that much of the oral history sort of focuses on the southeastern corner of Wood Buffalo National Park, sort of from Fort Chipewyan to Peace Point, and then along the Peace Rivers and Athabasca Rivers. It focuses a lot on a lake called Lake Claire, from which Birch River is a tributary, and then all the way to the Birch Mountains. And so all of these are really significant places within ACFN's traditional territory that were taken up by the park, which stretches over the boundary of Alberta and the Northwest Territories. So, those lands where people had lived and moved and harvested since time immemorial were essentially carved up and cut off from many Dene families as a direct result of the creation and expansion of this park, and specifically through some very restrictive management and permitting policies that were established over the course of the 20th century. And I'll talk about some of those later. But going back to sort of that context of Treaty 8, many of the elders that we spoke to explained to us that their rights to those territories within and outside of the park have never been extinguished through adhesion to Treaty 8, which took place in 1899. That in fact those rights were intended to be supported, sort of enshrined and protected through adhesion to Treaty 8. That this was an intergovernmental agreement that basically said that in return for sharing the traditional lands with incoming settlers, Dene people's inherent rights to land use and livelihood in that territory would be sustained in perpetuity. But what land users and families and leaders found only 2 decades after adhesion to Treaty 8 in Fort Chipewyan in 1899 was that promise, the central promise of Treaty 8 was ultimately violated through the creation of this park in 1922. So that's sort of the larger and I think very critical context that community members came with when sharing this oral history. The park itself was sort of under discussion, first proposed as early as sort of 1910 or 1911. Mm-hmm. At that point, it was being proposed as sort of a game sanctuary that was really urgently needed to preserve what was, at the time, the last known remaining herd of wood bison in North America. And but at that time, bison hunting was already prohibited, including bison hunting by treaty harvesters under an 1894 law. But the provisions of that law were set to expire by 1912. So a number of officials from the Department of the Interior, who, if you know anything about Parks Canada history in the 20th century, you'll probably recognize some of these names. Maxwell Graham, O.S. Finney, and F.H. Kiddo were, strong proponents of creating a national park that would cover the entire wood bison range from the Caribou Mountains to the Slave River in order to sort of maintain the control of the colonial state over the protection of the wood bison. These officials felt that, the protection of the wood bison was incongruous with the presence of Indigenous peoples who, like I said, had lived and harvested there since time immemorial. They felt that the only way to continue that, to maintain that population of wood bison in abundance, was to establish sanctuaries where no hunting or trapping should be allowed, essentially where people need to be pushed out, including people who had an Indigenous and treaty right to remain there. A really interesting quotation that comes from Maxwell Graham from, I think, 1912 that really sort of summarizes the perspective of these officials. It says that the interest of the entire people of this dominion, and to some extent that of the entire civilized world, is centered on the continued existence of these forms of animal life. And so these officials feel really strongly that, like, the identity of the empire, the identity of the so-called civilized world depends on the creation of these kinds of sanctuaries, which ultimately depend on expulsions of Indigenous peoples from their homes and their territories. So, long story short, after a bunch of back and forth with the Indian Affairs Branch and a hiatus on planning, which took place during the First World War, the initial boundaries of the park were established in 1922, and they encompassed 10,500 square miles on both sides of the Alberta and Northwest Territories border. And at that time, because of pushback from the Indian Affairs Branch, parks officials were sort of forced to allow some Indigenous folks to maintain their residence there and maintain their harvesting rights within the park. So anyone who was a member of a treaty nation at that time was permitted to stay in the park and continue to travel and harvest through those original park boundaries. A few years later, between 1925 and 1926, a decision was made to import several thousand plains bison from the south. This decision was made despite warnings from Dominion scientists and local land users who kind of foresaw the consequences of mixing two very different species. One of those herds, the plains herd, was already sick with brucellosis and tuberculosis. So almost 7,000 plains bison were shipped north via rail and barge to Wood Buffalo National Park. But shortly thereafter, many of them migrated outside of the boundaries, the original boundaries of the park, in order to feed near Lake Claire, which is an important place in ACFN's traditional territories and a place where a couple of settlement sites existed, where Dene families lived and harvested. And so in response to this migration, parks officials felt, well, now we have to protect these bison that migrated, so let's expand it, let's annex more lands. And so they did. They annexed an additional 7,000 square miles of Dene Southlin territories, which included those settlement sites at Lake Claire, and people were still living there and still harvesting there. So with that expansion, and that took place in 1926, the park became the largest national park in Canada and in the world. But the expansion was also accompanied with a really restrictive permitting system that refused many people access to their harvesting areas and their homes within the park, and became increasingly restrictive throughout the 1920s and 1930s, and then coincided with a number of other policies, conservation policies that restricted of harvesting of other species, both within and outside the park's boundaries. The rules were kind of complex. They were created sort of ad hoc at times. Some people were still allowed to stay in the park after 1926, but most, at least half of what at the time was called the Chipewyan Band, the Dene community, was denied the ability to return to the park, or if they weren't in there, or remain in the park if they had been there. And so that essentially split the community in half. And as you can imagine, that, of course, separated people from their territories, which were encompassed by the park, but also separated them from family members, immediate family members, and larger kinship networks that sort of held the community together. So,
right.
Those boundaries and the permitting system that went along with them had really profound impacts on the community from the beginning. Elders told us that their oral histories, which were passed to them from their elders, say that both the creation and the expansion of the park and the imposition of other restrictive game laws and the permitting system, all of those were imposed on Dene lives and lands without consultation and without the knowing consent of the first peoples of those lands. And there are some oral histories that suggest that if local leaders were consulted at all, and we talk about this quite a bit in the report, if representatives of the Parks branch ever tried to consult with leaders, Indigenous leaders in the area, those leaders were led to believe that the parklands would actually be eventually restored to them, so that the game sanctuary or the national park would eventually go away, and that this was just a temporary thing to allow the wood bison population to grow again. And so, but here we are 100 years later, and the park, of course, still stands, and many members of ACFN continue to experience exclusion from the park and displacement as a direct result of its existence. So all of those Dene families and land users who had lived and harvested and traveled along the Athabasca River, the Birch River, the Peace River, the Slave River, and the Gull River, and on the shores of many other bodies of water that were taken up by the park, saw their homes and their harvesting areas sort of swallowed up in these boundaries, and their access and their rights really restricted because of a permitting system that became increasingly strict and was upheld by a strong warden system. And they also saw their families and communities divided by park boundaries and permitting policies that governed not just Dene access, but Indigenous access generally to the park. So it's a long history, and the rules and regulations changed quite a bit over the course of the 1930s and 40s, and even to this day. So many complex processes that ultimately excluded people from their territories, which had been, their rights to those places were protected under Treaty 8. And all of those exclusions, those displacements, that dispossession that took place in the 1920s and 30s and 40s sort of continues to this day, and had some really long-term intergenerational impacts that we heard quite a bit about during interviews.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I think, one of the most important parts to the report in terms of underlining the ways in which colonialism in Canada and in the history of colonialism in Canada is a lot more complicated than maybe many Southern settlers might think. So, in the northern territories of what's now Canada, Indigenous peoples are still the majority population in many communities. And so, for Southerners, we might assume that displacement, dislocation from land and resources wouldn't occur in places in which there wasn't settler agricultural expansion moving into Indigenous territories and physically displacing Indigenous peoples from their land. But here's one of the prime cases of which parks and conservation played a role or was the engine of colonialism in this territory. This wasn't a case of thousands and thousands of white settlers moving into Dene territory and farming and setting up cities and industrializing the landscape, though that does happen through mining and other activities. But it's through the creation of a park that Indigenous peoples become dislocated from land and resources. And as you say, the community gets divided. How unusual is this, do you think, comparatively, in terms of the history of colonialism and the histories of parks and conservation? How does the experience in Wood Buffalo National Park compare to experiences elsewhere in Canada or elsewhere in the world?
Well, I would say, I think, historians of national parks and as colonialism in Canada and elsewhere in the world will probably recognize, common themes in this story that they've identified in the histories that they've written about, because globally, protected parks like Wood Buffalo National Park are, sort of key elements in the story of colonization and genocide in Indigenous territories. Virtually all protected parks, whether provincial, municipal, or federal in Canada, in the US and elsewhere around the world, are deeply embedded in the wider processes and structures of racialized colonial violence, on which this nation state, so-called Canada, is built. It's founded on those structures of violence. And so I think, if you're familiar with the history of national parks as colonialism or provincial parks as colonialism, you'll know that the common tendency to sort of celebrate the public discourse about protected nature areas like national parks are, tend to really uncritically celebrate these spaces as significant features of Canadian national identity and history and, important triumphs of 20th century environmentalism. But what we learned, of course, through by listening through these many oral histories, is that there's not a lot to celebrate here. This was a story of profound violence, and Tina Liu writes that that across Canada, parks and other game sanctuaries and similar places like that ultimately have the effect of marginalizing local peoples and local livelihoods and ways of living and knowing and being. And in that sense, they're central to the story of colonization. So, these become tools by which the Canadian colonial state sort of expands its reach in Indigenous territories. And so I think in a lot of ways there are similarities in this particular story with others. Many of the underlying discourses that sort of justify the creation of the park and the expulsion of Indigenous peoples, especially Dene peoples, from their territories would be familiar discourses. This idea that in order to preserve a pristine wilderness or to preserve a pristine space that people can appreciate the beauty of or whatever, you have to keep people out of there, and this sort of myth of the wilderness, and discourses about the importance of conserving species, like the one that I quoted before from Maxwell Graham. And then other, simultaneous processes like the development of tourism industries and the development of other commercial and extractive activities that take place outside of park boundaries but coincide with the impacts of park boundaries on Indigenous peoples. These are all happening. These all sort of underlie the creation of Wood Buffalo National Park and its management throughout the 20th century, and have, I keep saying, profound material outcomes and long-term outcomes and spiritual and cultural outcomes for Indigenous communities and territories. The deeply racialized assumptions about Indigenous land use are also sort of driving forces in the histories of protected nature spaces, and Wood Buffalo National Park is no exception. Parks officials, and that includes the three the names that I named before, and many others after them, often sort of vilify Indigenous lifeways as incongruous with this myth of the wilderness. And so this sort of justifies the violent eviction or coercive displacement of residents and harvesters from their territories. And so there's this sort of, all of those ideas about what these spaces need to be, what wilderness spaces are, what protected nature areas are, always coincide with racialized and gendered myths and falsehoods about Indigenous peoples, and those justify their displacement. And that's certainly the case in this history. So there are a number of sort of common themes, similarities across this history and other histories of national parks, from Banff National Park to some of the smaller provincial and municipal parks. And there's quite a bit of really great literature out there about protected nature areas as colonialism and as colonial violence. But there are also a number of sort of I think unique elements in this history. One is that this is one of not very many national parks where a very small amount and a very controlled amount of Indigenous harvesting was permitted, and so some communities and some community members were permitted to remain in the park after 1926, but many were denied access. And a lot of the reasons were very arbitrary all of the reasons were very arbitrary for excluding people. And so this sort of division of what at the time was called the Chipewyan Band and now is called ACFN, this division of families in the community between those with access to the park and those without, I think is kind of unique. And ultimately it leads to one of those sort of key elements to the story, again, that came up again and again in the oral histories and testimony that were shared with us. And what happened is that at some point between 1942 and 1944, someone in either in Indian Affairs or in the Parks branch sort of decides that that it would be easier to manage just one group of people that's living in the park. So by this time, there's a Cree settlement at Peace Point, and there are, which is also I should say it's a Dene settlement where there are also Cree residents, and then there's a Dene settlement down at Lake Claire, and both of these are, of course, encompassed by the park, and those who are living there and harvesting there have permits to do so, but of course have family members on the other side of the park boundary. And for one reason or another, it's not very clear from any of the archival sources why this happened. The Dene families who were in the park in 1944 were all transferred over to the Cree Band and became members of the Cree Band. One member described this as sort of a really huge change with long-term impacts on the community that just sort of happened at the stroke of a pen. People had no say in it. It's not clear why it happened, but essentially half of what then was called the Chipewyan Band was added to the Cree Band's treaty payroll list and sort of considered from that point on by government to be Cree people. And so there's quite a bit of discussion about this in the report, and we talk about it a little bit in the blog posts as well. But the oral histories tell us that whether the change was intended by the Parks branch to sort of simplify the administration of people's living in the park, or whether there was something more sinister happening that we don't know about, whatever the reasoning was, it was a really, really harmful change. And then that just sort of solidified the divisions that were already in place as a result of the permitting system. So, if you read the report, you'll see a lot of the commentary from folks talking about the impacts of the park points back to this transformation that occurred. And so that's one really, I think, unique element in this story. And the other one, I'll just say, I know I'm talking for a long time on this, but the other one that I think is important to point out is that Wood Buffalo National Park is also located directly north or downstream of the Northern Alberta oil sands, where state-supported extractive activity across Indigenous territories has been placing increasing pressure on Indigenous lands and waterways and communities for decades now, through the extraction of bitumen and sand, gravel, and other minerals, as well as through commercial fishing, harvesting, timber, and pulp. So there are a number of sort of extractive activities that are consuming more Dene lands outside of the boundaries of the park. And ACFN members and elders, see this, what some scholars call extreme extractivism, and the racialized politics that surround it, to be co-constitutive with the history of colonialism related to the park. So, the park sits in the middle of this story of extreme extractivism, and they were sort of work hand in hand to generate, particular impacts to the Indigenous peoples of that region.
Now, you mentioned oral histories were a significant component of the research. And as you've described it, this is part of a century-long work to document the history of Dene rights. So could you tell us a bit about the role that oral history played in this work? And maybe if I can add on an extra question here, what it means to you, to members of the community, to take local knowledge and memory and experience seriously in this kind of historical work?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, and like I said at the beginning, that I came to this work very late in the story. It's been ongoing for generations, for over 100 years, through the intergenerational transmission of these stories and of the oral histories. And, that is transfer of knowledge, that work of research that's been ongoing within the community, is central to the ongoing work of working towards reparations and healing and justice, that leaders like Elder Pat Marcel and many others before and since have been really aiming towards for a long, long time. So, but oral histories are central to that, our understanding of what happened. We wouldn't be able to tell this story without oral history. We really wouldn't be able to understand the impacts of the park on the community, on the many families that it displaced, on the many people who to this day continue to feel dispossessed and excluded from the park and separated from their kin within the park. We wouldn't be able to understand those impacts without hearing and really listening to the oral histories. And, oral knowledge has often not been taken seriously in the production of Western history. It's often treated as secondary or supplementary to other primarily Western produced types of knowledge, written forms of knowledge. And of course, that dominance of paper usually sort of coincides with denials and exclusions of knowledge of the oral histories. And so, and that is a key feature of the history of Wood Buffalo National Park. That includes not only the events that led up to its creation and its management throughout the 20th century, but also sort of the public's understanding, public discourse of that national park and of national parks generally. Because if we really are listening, we'll hear that in the case of Wood Buffalo National Park, the oral histories tell us that its creation and expansion was a violation of Treaty 8. It was a violation of promises that were enshrined in Treaty 8 and an infringement on Indigenous and treaty rights that the Dene Sutherland people hold. And so I think that by really listening and taking that oral history seriously, we can do the work of challenging dominant interpretations of Canadian national park history that exclude Indigenous knowledges and voices and ignore the central, the real nature of this history, which is that, park isn't necessarily something that we should be celebrating. It's founded on violence and harm, and it continues to enact violence and harm on Indigenous peoples and their lands. We can understand, we can really contextualize the park within the history of Treaty 8 by centering the oral histories. We would never be able to understand the both immediate and long-term impacts, the direct and cumulative impacts of the park by just reading written documents, right? Those are experiences that only people can tell us about, that people who have lived those impacts can tell us about. And many members and elders did tell us about those impacts. And so again, that listening is really critical. And then I guess I should also say that, not only does sort of centering the oral histories help us to, I guess, present a challenge or a counter narrative to sort of common stories that surround national parks, but also help us to see parts of the story that are either deliberately excluded or just not seen in written archival records. So, for example, when I was talking about the creation and expansion of the park, we heard from elders again and again that there was an oral promise made to leaders at the time. We heard one history that said there was no consultation whatsoever, and a number of elders said that. And then a number of other elders said, if there was any consultation, it included a promise that the land would be returned. And, that promise isn't in the archives. It's not written anywhere, but it was passed down. It was probably made orally, like many treaty promises were made. And then passed down from generation to generation. And so, that's a broken promise there. That's a broken contract that, was central to the creation of the park. And so, listening and taking seriously, local knowledge and members and elders' perspectives and experiences is critical to, really seeing the story for what it is, really hearing the harms and their profound impact that's lasted through generations. And then also, I think to really repair the damage, you have to really acknowledge what happened. And in order to do that, you've got to listen to the oral histories. You can't repair what you either don't know or have refused to listen to historically. So I think much of the work of sort of negotiating reparations and, public acknowledgement that the negotiating team is working on really depends on advancing the oral history of Wood Buffalo National Park and of its violent relations with ACFN and their Dene Sutherland ancestors.
So now that the report is published, it came out last year, and you've been disseminating it, sharing the findings more widely. Can you tell us more about what's going to come next? Where do you go next with this?
Yeah. So I should say first that we wrote this report and see this report as sort of like a living document, I guess, a living thing. And so it's, as we hear, feedback from members, it went through, it's been shared with members. It's been shared with members of the community, and of course anyone who spoke to us over the course of the research. And so anytime there's feedback or something that needs to be updated or changed or added or removed, we keep that document alive, and it's being updated as we go along. It belongs to the community. It's the copyright, of course, for all the knowledge that was shared and everything that's contained in that report belongs to ACFN. And so I think I had mentioned before that now it's, the intention, one of the intentions is to really get that story out there so that, it can make clear to others who don't know this story what happened, but also so that it can inform the ongoing negotiations with Environment Climate Change Canada and CIRNAC, which members of the negotiating team and leadership from ACFN are actively doing right now. So it's sort of informing that work, and my hope is that it'll do what the report itself will do what it needs to do, but it's full of really critical and powerful testimony. That's the sort of central driving force of the report itself and the driving force of the negotiations. So, like I said at the beginning, it has really been an honor and a privilege to be involved with this. And my hope is that, and Peter's hope is that sort of now it will, I guess, do its job and be useful in the process of negotiations. And the other sort of next step in this work, which a number of members of the community steering committee and leadership also suggested, is that maybe we can find a way to sort of publish the work beyond the report. So the blog posts that Niche published are an example, and then we are working towards sort of reframing the report to create a book manuscript that we're hoping will be published at a time that will coincide with the 100th anniversary of Wood Buffalo National Park, so the end of 2022. That the book will really center, even more so than the report, will really be focused primarily on the oral histories. So there's very little prose, very little writing from me, and most of it, what community members and leadership wanted to see was, the words of elders and members. Really, just sort of that's the text of the book. So that's what we're working on now.
And we're going to share this further with our listeners. You'll be able to find the link to all the blog posts that were published on the Niche website, as well as the link to read the full report on our show notes page, and we'll post that up on the website when this episode goes out. Sabina, thanks so much for sharing with us the story of this project and what went into it, and a little bit of the history of this park itself. I think this is a troubling story, but one that disrupts and complicates many narratives about environmentalism and Canadian history, and helps us see that history in a different way, a difficult way, but important to see it in new ways. So thank you very much.
Awesome. Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Sean.
Nature's Past is produced in Toronto on the traditional territories of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Anishinaabe Nation. The current treaty holders are the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and the territory is the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. This show is produced with support from the Network in Canadian History and Environment. This episode was made by Sabina Trimble, Tim Lee, and me, Sean Karash. Music for Nature's Past was licensed by Creative Commons. For details on the artists, please take a look at our show notes at niche-canada.org/naturespast, where you can also download new episodes, subscribe to the podcast with your favorite podcast player, and leave comments. You can also follow us on Twitter at twitter.com/naturespast. You can always find out more about the environmental history research community in Canada from the Niche website at niche-canada.org. And if you want to support this podcast and Niche, you can make a donation at niche-canada.org/support. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back soon with another episode of Nature's Past.